For 12 years, Gordon Mercer kept the files that Diane Ashworth wanted the world to forget. Every forged inspection report, every falsified safety certificate, every quietly buried complaint from a family who had trusted Ashworth Care Solutions with someone they loved. Gordon had a copy. He had not planned it that way. He had just never been the kind of man who threw things away. The town of Hartwell, Ontario sat 2 hours north of Toronto, in the kind of geography that rewards patience. Winters came early and stayed long. The lake at the edge of town froze solid by December and did not release its grip until April. Sometimes later, people in Hartwell did not talk much about the cold. They had learned over generations that the things you could not change were better acknowledged quietly and then worked around. Gordon Mercer had lived in Hartwell his entire life. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned to conserve energy across a long haul. He ran a home care coordination service out of a converted Victorian on Elgin Street. 3 rooms on the ground floor, a reception desk staffed by a woman named Helen Bryce, who had worked for him since the 2nd year, and a back office where Gordon kept the kind of documentation that home care coordinators are technically required to keep and practically never bother with. He was meticulous about it. Always had been. His daughter Sophie used to say that her father didn't throw away a grocery list, let alone a client intake form. She meant it as a mild criticism. She had said it once while helping him sort through a filing cabinet at age 14. And she had not understood until much later that the habit was not a flaw. Sophie was 23 now. She lived above the hardware store on Cedar Street with a cat named Wren and a nursing degree she had just finished. She called her father every Sunday at 7 in the evening, and on the Sundays when she forgot, he would sit at the kitchen table with a mug of tea and read through his case notes from the week and not quite notice that he was waiting. He had raised her alone since she was 9 months old. Her mother, Patricia, had died in the February of the year Sophie turned 1, a stroke so sudden and so early in the morning that by the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing left to do. Gordon had taken a week of leave from the Regional Health Authority where he had been working as a care coordinator, and then had gone back because he did not know what else to do with himself. He had found a woman named Agnes Fournier, 3 streets over, who ran a licensed home daycare, and he had brought Sophie there every morning at 7:45 and picked her up at 6, and somewhere in the years between those 2 fixed points, he had built a life. The arrangement with Ashworth Care Solutions had begun when Sophie was 11. Diane Ashworth ran the largest private home care network in the region. She had taken the company from a mid-sized operation to a regional giant in 7 years through a combination of aggressive contract bidding and a talent for making government regulators feel that oversight was a mutual inconvenience rather than a legal obligation. She was in her mid-40s, precise in her speech, and wore the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from certainty, but from years of practice at performing it. Ashworth Care Solutions had won the regional subcontracting tender over Gordon's firm by a margin that should not have been possible given their staffing ratios. Gordon had read the tender submission documents twice. The numbers did not add up. He had filed a query with the Regional Health Authority and received a response letter that used the word "unfortunately" 3 times and committed to nothing. What followed was not a formal arrangement. It was understood the way certain things in small professional communities are understood. Through tone, through implication, through the particular silence that follows an offer that the other party is meant to accept without requiring it to be stated clearly. Ashworth's office called Gordon's office and explained that they were experiencing capacity issues and would appreciate the ability to redirect certain complex cases to independent coordinators. Gordon would be compensated at a rate slightly above his standard fee. There would be paperwork, intake forms, service logs, incident reports, but it would be routed through Ashworth's system, not submitted independently. Gordon would handle the coordination. Ashworth would handle the billing. He had agreed because he needed the income and because at the time he had believed that the arrangement was, at its worst, an administrative gray area. The first time he understood that it was something else was 14 months later, when he coordinated care for a 78-year-old man named Arthur Pelling and discovered that the personal support worker assigned to Arthur's case had not completed the mandatory fall prevention training that Ashworth's own service agreement required. Gordon had flagged it internally. The response from Ashworth's operations manager had been brief and verbal. The training had been completed. The records simply had not been updated yet. And Gordon should not send written queries through the subcontracting channel on staffing matters. Gordon wrote it down anyway. He wrote down the date, the name, the nature of the flag, the response he received, and who had given it. He put the note in a folder at the back of the second drawer of the filing cabinet in his back office and went home and made Sophie's dinner. He told himself it was a habit. He told himself it was nothing. He had a good enough instinct for the difference between those two things to know, even then, that it was not nothing. Over the years that followed, the folders multiplied. Care plans that had been altered after incidents rather than before them. Staffing certifications that bore dates Gordon could not reconcile with the workers he had actually met. A complaint filed by the adult daughter of a client in Barrie that had never appeared in any of Ashworth's incident logs, but that Gordon had received a copy of because the daughter had CC'd every subcontractor listed on her mother's care agreement. He had kept that letter. He had written a summary of it and kept that too. Sophie came into the office one Saturday when she was 16 and found him at the cabinet, reorganizing the folders. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She had her mother's narrow face and Gordon's dark eyes. And when she looked at something she was thinking about, she had a habit of going very still. "Are those work files?" she asked. "Yes," Gordon said. "Are they important?" He considered the question more carefully than it probably required. "I don't know yet," he said. Sophie looked at the cabinet for another moment. "You're the only person I know who files things he doesn't know the importance of yet," she said. Gordon closed the drawer. "That's because most people throw things away before they find out." She had not answered that, but she had remembered it. She told him so years later after everything. The news reached Hartwell on a Thursday morning in late October. Gordon was reviewing a care transition report at his desk when Helen opened the back office door without knocking, which she only did when something warranted it. "There's something on the Regional Health Authority feed," she said. She held out her phone. The preliminary investigation notice covered 4 counties. The language was careful and bureaucratic, but the meaning was not. Ashworth Care Solutions was under review for systematic falsification of care records, including staffing certifications, incident reports, and service hours billed to both public health contracts and private clients. 3 clients in the affected region had experienced serious harm events during the review period. 1 had not survived. Gordon set Helen's phone on the desk. He looked at the row of filing cabinets against the back wall. There were 4 of them now, all the same dark gray, labeled by year. He did not feel vindicated. He felt tired in the particular way of someone who has been right about something for a very long time and has found no satisfaction in it. "Lock the front," he said. "It's 10 in the morning," Helen said. "I know. Lock it anyway." He called Sophie at 10:15. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she had already seen the news. "Dad," she said. "I'm all right." "Are you involved in this?" "As a subcontractor, yes. As a witness, probably." He paused. "I have documentation going back 12 years. There was a silence on Sophie's end that he recognized. It was the same stillness she had always used when she was processing something large. "How much documentation?" she said. "All of it," Gordon said. "In the glass-walled offices of Ashworth Care Solutions' downtown Toronto location, the collapse was not gradual. Regulatory investigations in the care sector have their own particular velocity. They begin slowly, gathering documentation, and then they accelerate the moment a paper trail is confirmed. The paper trail was confirmed within 36 hours of the initial notice. Diane Ashworth sat in her office on the 14th floor on a Friday evening with the lights low and the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She had a legal team working through the night. She had a communications firm managing the press. What she did not have was an independent corroborating record, something outside the company's own documentation that could demonstrate the timeline of decision-making and establish who had known what and when. Her senior legal counsel, a methodical man named Robert Featherstone, had laid out the problem with the particular directness that Gordon would have appreciated if he had been there to hear it. To survive the investigation with her position intact, Diane needed someone outside Ashworth who could speak to the operational realities of the subcontracting system. Someone who had worked within it, observed it, and could testify credibly that the systemic failures had originated below her level of authority. The only subcontractor in the region with both the professional standing and the documented case history to serve that function was Gordon Mercer. Featherstone had found the name in a compliance cross-reference file during document review. The reference was routine. It led to a home care coordinator in a small Ontario town with a billing relationship that appeared nowhere in the current operational records because it had been structured, deliberately, to appear nowhere. Diane drove to Hartwell the following Monday. She had not driven herself to a professional meeting in 6 years. The highway north of Toronto was clear, and the trees had gone to their late colors, birch and maple in yellow and rust against a gray sky. And she drove the 2 hours with the radio off, and the particular quality of focus that comes when a person has run out of smaller things to think about. Gordon was in the back office when Helen came to tell him a car had pulled into the lot. He had been expecting it. He had read enough about the investigation to understand the logic. He went out to meet her in the reception area rather than his office. He wanted the space to be neutral. Diane Ashworth looked like the photographs, but the posture was different. The photographs always caught her mid-statement, composed and forward-facing. In person, standing in the small reception of a home care office in Hartwell, with November light coming through the front window, she looked like someone who had been walking uphill for several days without admitting it. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "I know why you're here," Gordon said. He did not offer his hand. He gestured toward the chairs along the wall. "Sit down." She did. He sat across from her and looked at her the way he looked at care plans that didn't add up, not with hostility, but with the complete attention of someone who needs to account for every number before he decides what to do with it. "You want independent corroboration," he said. "You want someone outside the company who can speak to the operational timeline and establish that the systematic failures were not executive decisions." Diane Ashworth was not accustomed to having her situation described to her before she had described it herself. She adjusted to it. "Yes," she said. "And you came to me because I'm the only subcontractor with 12 years of documentation and the professional credibility to present it." "Yes." Gordon was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on Elgin Street. Helen had retreated to her desk and was making the particular noise of someone who was not listening. "What are you offering?" Gordon said. Diane named a consulting figure. It was significant. Gordon looked at the front window. "That's not what I need," he said. "What do you need?" He looked back at her. "I need you to come into my back office and read 12 years of records with me. And when you're done, I need you to tell me, honestly, whether you knew." Diane Ashworth had prepared for negotiation. She had not prepared for that. The moment extended. From the back of the building came the sound of the old baseboard heater clicking on against the November cold. Then the front door opened and Sophie came in. She had not called ahead. She had the key to the office that she had carried since she was 12, and she had driven the 4 blocks from Cedar Street because she had seen Diane Ashworth's car in the lot from the coffee shop window across the street, and she had wanted to be present. She was wearing her nursing jacket and carrying a paper bag from the cafe. She looked between her father and the woman he was sitting across from with the assessment of someone trained to read a room's tension accurately. "Sorry," she said. She was not sorry. "I brought lunch." She looked at Diane with the direct, unbothered courtesy of someone who is not afraid of the person in front of her. "Do you want coffee?" "Helen usually makes a pot around now." Diane looked at her, then at Gordon. Something in her expression shifted by a small degree that was difficult to name. "Thank you," Diane said. "Yes." Gordon looked at his daughter for a moment. "Go see Helen," he said. Sophie left the bag on the reception desk and disappeared down the hall. The door to Diane swung back. "She's yours," Diane said. "Yes." A silence with something in it that Diane did not immediately process and then did. "How old is she?" 23. She was 9 months old when her mother died. Diane looked at the window. The birch trees in the lot had lost most of their leaves. A few clung to the upper branches. She did not say she was sorry. She said, "She doesn't seem afraid of anything." "She isn't," Gordon said. "She gets that from her mother." He stood. "The back office is this way." The filing cabinets took up the entire interior wall of the back office. 4 of them, identical, labeled by year in Gordon's particular handwriting. Block letters, consistent, the way an engineer labels a diagram. Diane stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. Gordon opened the oldest cabinet and removed a folder from the first labeled section. He set it on the table. "First delivery under the subcontracting arrangement," he said. "November 12 years ago. 3 cases redirected from your Burlington office. I flagged an unlicensed supervision issue within the first month." He turned a page. The response I received instructed me not to submit written queries through the subcontracting channel on staffing matters. I documented the instruction the same day. Diane reached for the folder. Her hands, Gordon noticed, were not entirely steady. She read. He did not rush her. He stood at the other end of the table with his arms at his sides and let her work. She read for a long time. Folder by folder, year by year, the record of what her company had done in the places it thought no one was watching closely enough to write it down. Sophie brought coffee in at some point and left again without comment, which was the kind of intelligence Gordon had always been quietly proud of. By the time Diane set the last folder on the table, something in the room had changed in a way that was difficult to describe, except to say that it was quieter than it had been, in the way that rooms get quiet when the thing that has been unsaid for a long time has finally been placed on the table between two people. You flagged every one of these, she said. It was not a question. Everyone I could document, yes. And you kept filing them? Yes. She looked at the row of cabinets. Why? Gordon considered how to answer that. Because I'm a care coordinator, he said finally. The whole point of the work is that someone keeps track of what happens to people when they're not in a position to keep track of it themselves. I couldn't stop doing that just because it was inconvenient for your operation. Diane was quiet for a moment. I didn't know about the falsified certifications, she said. I need you to know that. I know it doesn't. I believe you, Gordon said. He sat down across from her. But believing you doesn't fix the problem. The problem is that the system was structured so that you wouldn't have to know. Someone did that deliberately. Someone made decisions about what reached your desk and what didn't. And then the people those decisions affected were real people, in their homes, with needs that didn't get met because the worker who was supposed to meet them wasn't qualified, and someone had forged a document to say that they were. He set his hands flat on the table. He did not sound angry. He sounded the way a person sounds when they have been a long time in a room with a hard truth and have come to know its exact shape. Arthur Pelling, he said. 78. Hartwell. I flagged his case in the 3rd month of our arrangement. Unlicensed false supervision. The flag was dismissed verbally. He fell 14 months later. He spent 6 weeks in hospital. He went in to managed care. He died there. He paused. I read his obituary in the Hartwell Gazette. I keep the local papers. I always have. Diane said nothing for a long time. Through the wall they could hear the quiet sounds of the office. The heater. The faint sound of Helen at her desk. And once, briefly, Sophie's voice on what was probably a phone call at the far end of the hall. I'm going to ask you something, Gordon said. And I'm asking it because I spent 12 years in a room with your company's decisions, and I need an honest answer before I decide what to do. Diane looked at him. Did you know the subcontracting arrangement was designed to keep documentation off the official record? The silence lasted long enough that Gordon understood it was not a silence of consideration. It was the silence of someone who was deciding how truthful to be. I knew the arrangement was structured to maintain flexibility, Diane said finally. I understood that meant less formal routing. I did not ask what that meant at the operational level. Gordon nodded once, slowly. That's what I thought, he said. That's the part that's going to matter most. He called the Regional Health Authority's investigation office that afternoon and informed them that he had independent documentation relevant to the review and would be making it formally available. The investigator on the call was a woman named Sandra Vieux, who had a voice that suggested she had been waiting for this call for some time. Diane remained in Hartwell that evening. Robert Featherstone drove up from Toronto that night, and they sat in the motel on the highway for 3 hours going through Gordon's timeline. Featherstone was thorough and professional, and by the end of the meeting had a clear picture of what the documentation established, that the systematic failures had originated in the middle operational layer of the company, that Diane's executive team had been structured, deliberately, by the person who ran compliance, to be insulated from direct knowledge, and that Gordon's 12-year record was the most complete independent account of that structure that currently existed. The person who had run compliance at Ashworth for 9 of those 12 years was a man named David Croft. David Croft had come to Ashworth from a regional health authority. He understood the regulatory language well enough to navigate it from the inside. He had built the subcontracting routing system. He had designed the documentation structure. He had made the decision 9 years earlier to redirect the most problematic cases, the ones with the highest likelihood of generating complaints, to subcontractors who billed under Ashworth's umbrella but whose records would not be surfaced in a standard internal audit. Gordon had not known David Croft's name for most of those 12 years. He had known there was a person making systematic decisions about what information reached him and what did not, because you can read that kind of intentionality in a documentation gap the same way you can read a break in a pattern when you've been tracking something long enough. He had written that observation down in the 6th year, in the back of a folder he had labeled, with characteristic precision, structural inference. David Croft called Gordon's office on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks into the formal investigation. Helen took the call, recognized from the caller ID that it was an Ashworth number, and brought Gordon the message without comment. Gordon called back from his personal phone, standing in the parking lot behind the office in the November cold, because he wanted Helen to be able to say honestly that she had not heard the conversation. David Croft's offer was specific and efficiently delivered. The documentation Gordon had assembled could be characterized, in formal testimony, as reflecting routine operational variation rather than systematic concealment. Certain compliance gaps could be attributed to regulatory ambiguity rather than intentional falsification. In exchange, a professional services retainer would be established at a figure that David Croft named. Gordon listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Do you know a woman named Ruth Calloway?" David Croft said nothing. 64 years old, Gordon said. She was a client of one of your redirected subcontractors in Aurelia. The worker assigned to her care in 2019 had a first aid certification that had lapsed 14 months prior. The certification in your system said it was current. Ruth Calloway fell down 8 steps. She was in rehabilitation for 5 months. She does not go upstairs anymore. He paused. I have her intake form, the worker's certification documentation, and the incident summary I wrote at the time. I have copies of all 3. David Croft said, "You can't prove I knew about that specific case." "I don't have to," Gordon said. "I just have to give everything I have to Sandra Vieux and let the investigators establish the pattern. They're quite good at that, I'm told." He went back inside. Sophie came that afternoon and found him at the cabinet pulling the folders he had prepared for the formal submission. She stood in the doorway the way she had at 16, going still. "Is it over?" she asked. "The hard part," he said. She came in and sat on the edge of the spare chair. She watched him work for a while in the companionable quiet they had always been able to maintain together. "Were you ever scared?" she said. "All those years?" Gordon thought about it genuinely. "In the 3rd year," he said, "I had a bad quarter. We nearly lost 2 contracts and I almost considered whether the documentation was worth the risk of someone finding out I had it." He closed a drawer. "Then I remembered that the alternative was throwing it away, and I couldn't do that. The information was about real people. You don't throw away records of what happened to real people." Sophie looked at him for a moment. "You never told me any of this," she said. "You were a child for most of it." "And then I wasn't." "No," Gordon said. "And then you weren't." He set the last folder in the box. "I thought about telling you when you started nursing school, but I didn't want it to color how you saw the work. The work is good work. What Ashworth did to it doesn't change that." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't change it," she agreed. "But it's why the work matters." The formal submission went to the investigation office on a Friday. Gordon drove it there himself. 4 boxes in the back of his car, 12 years in the trunk. Sandra Vieux met him in the lobby of the Regional Health Authority building and they carried the boxes up together. She did not make small talk. He appreciated that. The investigation hearing took place over 2 days in January. Gordon gave his testimony on the first morning. He sat at the witness table in a dark sweater and gray trousers and spoke from a 1-page summary he had prepared, though he did not need it. The structure of what he had observed was organized in his memory the way well-filed documentation is organized, chronologically, clearly, with every item in its proper relation to the others. When the committee chair asked him why he had maintained independent records over such an extended period, Gordon was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm a care coordinator," he said. "The clients in those records couldn't document what was happening to them. Someone had to." David Croft gave his testimony on the 2nd afternoon, with 2 legal representatives and a prepared statement. By the 3rd hour, his account of operational authority and decision-making had begun to contradict itself in ways that the committee noted aloud. The gaps in Ashworth's internal records, measured against the completeness of Gordon's independent documentation, established a picture that the prepared statement could not revise. The outcome was formal. David Croft faced charges relating to falsification of regulatory submissions and professional misconduct. Diane Ashworth was formally removed from the list of primary subjects following the submission of her own corrected organizational review. Gordon was cited in the investigation summary as having provided independent documentation of central evidentiary importance without which the full scope of the concealment could not have been established. Helen printed the summary and put it on his desk with a post-it note that said, "In case you needed it in writing." He folded it and put it in the top drawer. 2 months later, on a Friday afternoon in March, when the snow was beginning to pull back from the edges of the roads in Hartwell, Diane Ashworth came back. She did not call ahead. Gordon looked up from the desk when Helen opened the back office door and told him, and he understood why she had come. She was carrying a manila envelope. She sat across from him and set it on the desk. "The board has completed its governance review," she said. "As part of the corrective measures, the company is restoring formal attribution for the operational frameworks that have been misrepresented internally." Gordon looked at the envelope but did not open it immediately. 12 years ago, she said, when you flagged the first staffing issue and were instructed to stop submitting written queries. That flag should have reached my desk. The protocol that prevented it was David Croft's. It wasn't yours." She paused. "You built a documentation system inside a subcontracting structure that was designed to prevent documentation. What you did with those files is the reason we can trace what happened to Arthur Pelling, and to Ruth Calloway, and to the others. The board wanted that formally acknowledged." Gordon opened the envelope. Inside was a single page on Ashworth Company letterhead, signed by the board chair. It named Gordon Mercer as having maintained independent care coordination records of professional integrity throughout the period of the subcontracting arrangement, and formally acknowledged that his documentation practices had exceeded the standards required by the arrangement, and had been conducted in the absence of any institutional support. It was not money. It was not a contract. It was a sentence that said his name and told the truth about what he had done. He read it twice. "I can't give back 12 years, Diane said. "No," Gordon said, "but I can make sure the record says what actually happened." He set the letter down on the desk. Outside, on Elgin Street, a car went by slowly, navigating the slush at the curb. The baseboard heater clicked. From the front office came the sound of Helen on a call. "Did you learn anything?" Gordon said. "From all of this?" Diane considered the question with the careful attention she had learned in the past several months to give to questions she would once have answered reflexively. "I learned," she said, "that the people who seem to be working quietly in the background are often the only ones doing the actual work." Gordon nodded. It was enough. He walked her out. On the front step, Diane Ashworth looked at the street, the small downtown of Hartwell, the hardware store on the corner, the cafe across the way, the bare trees just beginning to show the first suggestion of buds at their tips. "It's a good town," she said, "not as a compliment, but as a recognition." "It asks for patience," Gordon said. "Most people learn to give it." He watched her car pull out of the lot and turn south, toward the highway in Toronto and the long work of rebuilding what had been damaged. Then he went back inside. Sophie was there. She had come in the side door while he was walking Diane out, and she was in the back office with Helen, looking at the letter on the desk. She looked up when her father appeared in the doorway. "Is it real?" she said. She meant the letter. She also meant all of it. "Yes," Gordon said. She looked at the row of filing cabinets. The labels ran from the earliest year to the most recent, each one in the same handwriting, each one a year's worth of evidence that somebody had been paying attention. "What do you do with them now?" she said. Gordon went to the first cabinet and opened the top drawer. He looked at the folders inside. The careful handwriting, the dates, the names of people who had needed someone to keep track of what happened to them. "Same thing I always did," he said. He closed the drawer. "Keep them." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, with something in her expression that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but was made of both those things. "Okay," she said. She put her coat on. "I'll come for dinner Sunday." 7 o'clock, he said. She went out the side door. He heard her car start, then pull away. Gordon went back to his desk and sat down and picked up the case notes from that morning and continued reading from where he had left off, because there was still work to be done, and the work had never waited for him before. For 12 years, Diane Ashworth had used the back channels of Gordon Mercer's quiet office to set down the things her company did not want accounted for, what she had not understood, what David Croft had not understood, What none of them had fully reckoned with was that Gordon Mercer had spent his entire adult life in the business of making sure that what happened to people was written down somewhere, accurately and permanently, so that when it mattered, someone could find it. He had been patient because the work required patience. He had been thorough because the people in his files deserved thoroughness. And he had kept every record because he was a care coordinator, and care coordinators do not discard data about the people who have been entrusted to their attention. Someday had taken 12 years to arrive. He had been ready for it the entire time. I keep thinking about that filing cabinet. Not the investigation, not the hearing, not the moment David Croft's account fell apart under questioning. Just the cabinet. 4 drawers. 12 years. Every folder in the same handwriting. Gordon Mercer didn't build that record because he was planning something. He built it because he couldn't not. Because he was the kind of person who understood. Somewhere beneath all the exhaustion of raising a child alone and running a small business in a town that asks for patience, that the people in those folders deserve to have someone paying attention. That's the thing I come back to when I think about what the story actually means. It isn't really about a corporate investigation. It's about what a person decides to do when they're tired and underpaid, and the system around them is designed, very deliberately, to make integrity feel like a losing proposition. Gordon made a choice every single time he opened that drawer and added another folder. Not a dramatic choice, a quiet one, the kind that nobody sees and nobody rewards, and that costs something real over a long period of time. There's a word for that kind of steadiness. Not toughness in the way we usually mean it, not stubbornness or bravado, but the particular durability of a person who has decided that their own standard of conduct doesn't change depending on whether anyone is watching. Gordon had that. He had it on the Thursday mornings when the Ashworth van showed up and he wrote down the batch code. He had it when Sophie was 16 and found him reorganizing folders and asked if they were important, and he told her honestly that he didn't know yet. He had it when David Croft called with an offer, and Gordon's answer was the name of a woman in Aurelia who couldn't use the stairs anymore. What I find myself thinking about is the intelligence of it. Not cleverness, but the genuine, careful kind of intelligence that knows the difference between what a document says and what it means. Gordon read those files the way a good care coordinator reads a care plan, looking for what doesn't add up, noting where the pattern breaks, understanding that the gap between what is recorded and what actually happened is exactly where the truth lives. He didn't have lawyers or leverage. He had 12 years of careful observation and the discipline to write it down. And then there's Sophie, 23 years old, letting herself into her father's office because she saw an unfamiliar car in the lot and wanted to be present. Asking Diane Ashworth if she wanted coffee with the kind of steady, unbothered courtesy that you don't learn from a textbook. That came from somewhere. It came from watching a man spend 12 years doing the right thing in a back office in Hartwell without ever being recognized for it. Children learn what they see repeated. Sophie saw her father choose integrity, quietly and consistently, for her entire life. I don't think the lesson here is that patience is always rewarded. Sometimes it isn't, and we should be honest about that. The lesson is simpler and harder than that. It's that the quality of your character, the rigor of your thinking, and the willingness to keep going when it costs you. Those 3 things together are the only foundation that doesn't shift. Gordon Mercer didn't win because the universe corrected itself. He was ready when the moment came because he had spent 12 years becoming the kind of person who would be. That's not a small thing. That's everything.